Last week? This shit happens every week.
The Assassin's Creed titles. They launch every year and give us some fun and enjoyment, but recently they've moved into a bi-yearly release. Now, to fill that gap this year, they get to boost an old version, Odyssey, to the levels of the recently released AC Valhalla at 60 FPS on the newer gen consoles. I'm sure completely unrelated to the cost reduction on the stores of the title, but historical accuracy remains valid, and that means you still cannot use any staircases in your two-story apartment. But what does this offer on the PS5 and the Series X over the previous releases, and how does it stack up against the PC? Let's take a look. So first up, this is nothing more than a BC patch, just as I discussed way before these consoles launch, so the developers can go back and make simple tweaks to the engine configuration very easily and simply, and just update visuals or performance to the levels that were already in the engine. In this case, they seem to have gone back and just simply taken the latest patch that was available on the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X and just unlocked the frame rate to 60 FPS, nothing more than that. But here, to make sure I get a like-for-like comparison, I'm comparing the two disc versions that I have both on the PS4 and the Xbox. This gives us another quick brief look at the changes that happen in modern gaming in terms of titles releasing that aren't quite ready for that day one patch update just yet. As you can see here, there's been changes to screen space reflections, some of the shadow features, and even the hair quality on the main character. It's much shorter, his top is now lower than it was on the original release. So some of these changes you can see here are not down to the update patch, they're just from the original release that was then subsequently patched up to this point. Patch 1.55 here on the PlayStation. You can also see here that in BC mode on the PS5, that disc version runs almost exclusively at the highest resolution ceiling of 2880 by 1620 of that PS4 Pro version that it is running here. This is then lowered once you boost it to the 1.55 patch and then unlock that frame rate to 60 FPS. Visually, it is the same as the previous patches, but it is changed from the original disc release. Like I say, these are subtle updates to the version to get it closer to the target. You can see things like depth of field added in, like I say, the changes to the character model and hair. And the Xbox version, just like the PlayStation version, uses DRS also, which means it can go from a high of 3840 by 2160 right down to 2432 by 1368. And as I say, it now dynamically scales to the lower bounds rather than the upper bounds once this patch is applied. And that means you get, on average, a higher resolution on the Series X than you do on the PS5. Taking this opening cutscene as an example, here you can see on the right the PS5 is 2560 by 1440, and on the left the Series X is 2880 by 1620. So 20% to 26%, depends where you divide it, higher on the Series X. And this happens throughout the test. The Series X is generally a higher resolution than the PS5, but both of them are lower than they used to be before the patch. And that means in heavy action, what you are predominantly seeing is on the Series X, the resolution is predominantly those lower bounds of 2432 by 1368, and in heavy action the PS5 is at the lower bounds of 1920 by 1080, and that gap is too big, and therefore we see a degradation in performance on the Series X when those heavy action scenes crop up, with the PS5 holding onto the lock 60 pretty much throughout these heavier sections. But as you can see, compared to the Series X, it can drop somewhere around 50 FPS at its lowest point versus 57 on the PS5, so somewhere between 12 and 14%. And that deficit brings it back, so they should really be scaling at the same level, but overall the Series X has the better image quality. It doesn't dip that often to really be a problem. It's only in these heavy sections, or certainly when you're sinking in the heavier cities later on, but overall the performance is better on the PS5 and the Series X, and the image quality is better on the Series X than the PS5. Bringing us back to image quality, it is a title that obviously scales with the resolution. The higher up, the sharper things look, but there's a limit to that. So obviously going from a 900p predominantly on the Xbox One S to 1440p on the PS5, it looks better, it looks sharper, there's more detail in those finer elements, those high frequency elements on his armor plate. But overall, the game isn't swamped with those. So things like the ground textures, the UV maps, they're using very low mip maps stretched across large areas, which makes them look very muddy and very low quality. quality. And that means at a certain point, you don't get a huge amount of difference. So here going from 900p to 1620p and then almost 4K on the Series X, there's definitely an improvement in image quality and sharpness, but not as much as there is to that terrain. So that geometry increase, the level of tessellation being used, the shadows, the AO, everything else improves the image quality on the Series X and the PS5 over the Xbox One S more than just the resolution. It's definitely sharper and cleaner, but it's not a high frequency title. And the Xbox One S was a title that really showed the worst of how the game could perform. Generally, it was better than Valhalla because it doesn't tear, which is always a benefit. It is a V-synced title, and in general play, it does a good job of holding 30 FPS. There's more popping, there's obviously more issues with LOD, but it can dip in traversing the world, lots of denser areas, and when you're streaming data in and out of RAM, so just spinning the camera around at certain points or flying high with long views, that can cause the Xbox One S to dip down to 25 FPS kind of levels. The worst points tend to be in those cinematics because they tend to lock the resolution much higher. They don't dynamically scale as much as in gameplay. And that means it's GPU bound quite heavily in those sections, and therefore you get heavier dips.
Just leave.
Pleasure doing business with you, Doris.
Keep my name off your lips. I don't want the Cyclops coming after me for the debt you can't pay.
So it definitely has performance areas to improve, which the newer gen consoles absolutely do. And generally they are 60 FPS. It's a decent update. It's a very simple update in terms of workload, but overall it's a 60 FPS on both consoles by and large. But again, does this mean that we're getting all that power in this backwards compatibility title? And obviously it's not. Backwards compatibility titles are limited, even on the Xbox, in terms of what they can do. The Series X obviously has a better configuration, which I've discussed to death before on the channel, but overall it works better on these titles. We can see that in other elements, such as the loading, which you can see here. It is faster on the Series X and the PS5 because they can leverage that API a little better, and it doesn't do that on the PS5, where it basically sticks to the limitations as much as possible as the PS4 Pro. But it's obviously a significant improvement on both of them compared to what it was on the Xbox One S, so that's already a win in my book. But again, the title and the engine, the Anvil Next engine, isn't known for its superb performance even on PC. So using a pretty decent spec PC here with a Ryzen 3600 and an AMD 5600 XT, again, this is a pretty powerful machine, but running this title at 1440p, it's never a locked 60 FPS, even at settings as close as possible to what the consoles are running here. And that means you get dips and inconsistencies throughout, but it's not just a hardware based issue. As you can see here with one view on the PC staring in one direction, the reduction in GPU load, because it's stalling both on the CPU and the GPU side, means utilization drops down to around 70 something percent. You can see the power usage of the GPU dropping alongside it. But spin the camera around to another viewpoint and that utilization goes back up to 100%, and the GPU is heavily used, the CPU is used, and therefore the performance goes up, and so does the power gain. So the title has issues inherent to the engine of how it handles its rendering, how it's handling multiple AI paths, pathfinding, everything else going on in that engine means that there are issues in the title that can cause dips and performance issues that are not directly related to the hardware you run it on. You could have a far more powerful GPU than you've got here, as we have in the consoles, and it would still dip. But that said, the console versions do seem to be in a better state overall than the PC version in terms of these issues. They don't happen as often, and that might be a symptom of how they're spread across the different AMD drivers, the NVIDIA drivers, but overall performance is very close to better than what you get on PC of a similar spec hardware, and maybe even more. So it's a nice free boost if you want to play the title at 60 FPS. Doesn't transform it by any means. The loading is faster on Series X, but the image quality is also better on Series X, but performance is better on PS5. But again, most of the time, they're pretty much nigh on identical, so it's not a huge gain either way, but certainly if you are interested, then now no better time to play Odyssey on the Series X and the PS5. Obviously, those inherent profiles being used here for the PS5 and Xbox Series X in that backwards compatibility mode means you get better performance because the Xbox One X has 9 gig and the PS4 Pro has 5.5. Therefore, things like flying high and then going back to the character, it still loads back in on the PS5 and it's almost instantaneous on the Series X, like it was on the Xbox One X. These are the limitations of these backwards compatibility profiles. I would assume the Series S is very good. It's most likely going to run the same 1600 by 900p version here, but because I've got physical disc versions of both, I can't test this on the Series S. That's the only reason it's not in this test, but I'm not going to rush out and buy £20 or so on another downloadable version of it. So just obviously assume that the Series S is going to be around 900p and a pretty similar level of a locked 60 FPS. Anyway, that's my fast look at Assassin's Creed Odyssey update on the PS5 and the Series X with a comparison to the PC. Remember, if you like what I do here, I am completely self-funded and independent. So any support you can give on my Patreon, and obviously commenting down below for the algorithm, liking, subscribing, and all of that really helps me immensely. I'll be back very soon with more content, but for now, I'm out, and I'll catch you on the next one.
There they are. I'll sneak up on the Malakes.
You have a lesson to learn.
If the Cyclops wants to teach me, tell him to come here himself.